Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Chris Uhlmann. Coming up, winners and losers, what the party's internal polling is saying about seats around the country, the key issues that could make or break the campaign, and can a shandy drinker really win over Western Sydney? Our regular Friday election panel for the last time. John Howard's former Chief of Staff, Arthur Sinodinos, ABC Online Chief Political Writer, Annabelle Crabb, and in Canberra, former Labor Senator, Stephen Loosley. Well, we can see the finish line from here after what seems like one of the longest and strangest election campaigns. Yes, just one more sleep until polling day. The leaders have been working hard for every last vote. Julia Gillard has been visiting marginal seats from the central coast of New South Wales to John Howard's old electorate in Sydney. On the final day, her message has turned negative, endlessly warning that a vote for Tony Abbott is a risk.
So my message to the Australian people is this. When voting tomorrow, there is a real chance that Tony Abbott could be Prime Minister on Sunday. And if that happens, there will be work choices on Monday. This is a risk for Australian working families. And I say to Australian working families, don't risk your future with Mr Abbott.
Well, Mr Abbott has also been relentlessly on message, meanwhile focusing on the hot-button issues of immigration and economic management.
If you want to stop the boats, you've got to change the government. If you want to stop the taxes, you've got to change the government. If you want to see a $100,000 cut in immigration, you've got to change the government. If you want to see a competent administration, you've got to change the government.
Arthur Sinodinos, this last 36-hour no-sleep tour, is there a sense of momentum that's gathering with that?
I think Abbott is trying to galvanise the electorate, create a bandwagon effect. He's had a pretty strong finish to the week. I think Julia Gillard's finish to the week hasn't been as strong. I think the launch at the beginning of the week was a bit flat. It had one sort of broadband health-related initiative, and that was about it. I didn't think it was a great start to the week. Abbott is looking relaxed, comfortable, dare I say, smiling. So he looks like someone who feels he's done his best, and the adrenaline, I suspect, is keeping him going. But that could make an impression on voters. Don't forget, there may be 10% or so of people out there who haven't made up their minds, may not make up their minds till they get in the booth, and it may come down to a likeability factor. Who do they feel comfortable with? I think Gillard's view of what the risks are with Abbott is exaggerated. I don't think it's cutting through because work choices, well, you can't get it through the Senate for a start. So even if he had some secret plan to do it, he couldn't get it through next week, next month or next year. So I'm not sure the scare campaign is credible. I think she'd be better to be positive about, look, we've wiped the last 3 years. OK, things went wrong, but I'm here to make a new start and give me a go and play on the fact that she is new.
Annabelle?
Yeah, look, I think there is a bit of panickiness that's really evident in Labor's campaign at this very sharp end of the experience. They are a bit rattled because of this late swing back to the coalition that seems to have been described by a news poll in The Australian this morning that seems to have been concentrated in New South Wales and Queensland. And that is adding to this panic. And I think that Julia Gillard's decision to make her last message this really hopelessly exaggerated threat about Tony Abbott and work choices, that somehow electing... I mean, I see her point, of course, and I do think that Tony Abbott, without a commitment to further industrial relations reform, is not really Tony Abbott. But, you know, you've got this sort of line that says if you elect Tony Abbott on Saturday, you'll have work choices on Monday, which I think is not the case. So, look, you've got that that last-minute kind of sharpening of the message to an incredible point, and up against that you've got Tony Abbott, who's sort of bolting around various electorates and ordering shandies and having hits of tennis with John Alexander and he's looking energetic and positive, and I think that line of his, that routine that he's had in the last couple of days where he says, well, look, you know, am I prepared to work for it? Well, yes, you know, I am up for it and I'm going to go for a 20k jog just to prove it. I mean, it's kind of basic, but it's in a campaign that has not been distinguished by great and sweeping themes, at least provides a sort of a positive vibe.
Stephen Loosley, what's your sense of it?
I think the Prime Minister's had a very good final week. I think the campaign launched effectively on Monday for the last week at Brisbane was entirely appropriate. It was measured and it was well targeted. She's been under some pressure, but always the PM comes through, and I thought she's been very comfortable in different circumstances. In terms of work choices, it's important to know that as people look at the poll on Saturday, over the last 24 hours or so, one of the issues that will arise in a lot of people's minds is, will a future coalition government go back to some of the nastier edges of the previous? And work choices looms large there, given that it was never announced prior to 2004 but appeared in the subsequent period of the Howard government. And Tony Abbott, of course, has argued for work choices in the Parliament and in his book and so on. So I think that's entirely legitimate for the Prime Minister to focus upon that as an issue which does really hit home for a lot of working people who are just starting to look at how they'll vote tomorrow.
My point, Stephen, is probably just that, you know, in the business end of the campaign, you do tend to have this kind of tightening of the message, so it just becomes, you know, you will get work choices on Monday, just like Tony Abbott today, for instance, equally exaggeratedly, I think, has said, well, look, you know, elect me, and immediately the number of boats arriving in Australian waters will cut back to 3 a year. He's been able to be quite precise about that figure today. I think that they're kind of much of a muchness on either side.
Arthur?
I don't think he needed to nominate 3 boats a year as the benchmark for success. I think the benchmark for success is putting in place a policy framework that over time sort of deters people from coming here. Obviously, he was being badgered by the press, so he decided to throw them a bone. But, yeah, I suppose that's something that people will factor in. But just to Stephen's point about work choices, in 2004 the Coalition gained a majority in the Senate, which gave it a capacity to do it. That is not on offer this time, so even if there was a plan there, I don't think it would happen. And I just think it would suit Julia Gillard's persona better at the moment if she was more positive, because I don't think that she's been, or Labor have been able to leverage the risk on Abbott. Abbott's done a very good job in this campaign of appearing and becoming more prime ministerial, and to the point where I don't think you can beat him with those sorts of negatives.
Stephen, don't you think that they concentrate too much on this idea, leading up to this campaign even, that Tony Abbott was going to explode at some stage, and clearly he's grown as this campaign's gone on?
There is no doubt that Tony Abbott has campaigned well above expectation. He's been disciplined and focused and much more measured than we saw him in 2007, for example, where there were a couple of quite appalling moments.
Maybe there's a plan in that, Stephen. Maybe he was just setting the bar as low as he possibly could, always knowing that at some stage he'd have to leap it.
It's always a matter of expectations, Chris, and that brings me to voter expectations. There's a Galaxy poll the last 24 hours which I found particularly interesting, showing the two-party preferred vote 52 ALP 48 coalition, which is the exact reverse of where Newspoll was, of course, just a week or so ago. Galaxy's been pretty accurate, and it may prove instructive tomorrow. Now, as to expectations, when people actually get into the polling booth and they think about who's going to have the keys to the lodge for the next 3 years, they look most carefully at the challenger, and quite often they balk. They balked at Billy Snedden, for example, in 74, or Andrew Peacock in 90, John Hewson in 93, and certainly Mark Latham in 2004. So you have a circumstance in which the Leader of the Opposition has got to pass that final hurdle of convincing the electorate it's time to hand over the keys, and I suspect Tony Abbott may be just a little short on that.
I think, if I can come in on that, my view is you've got 2 opposition leaders running at the moment. Julia hasn't been there long enough to establish her authority in her own right as Prime Minister. She may, in retrospect, rue the fact that she went as early as she did and didn't give herself more time to get a few issues settled and get the, I suppose, the electorate comfortable with her in the top job. and
if she'd listened to Sinodinos, she would have
well,
known
I
to
did
wait.
write this in the column at the time, but be that as it may, whatever the result tomorrow, I think she would have benefited from more time in the top job, because that would have put then more onus on Abbott to prove his bona fides, whereas in some ways his job has been made a bit easier by the fact that she's running from a very short start.
I reckon if you had the benefit of hindsight and you were running Julia Gillard's campaign, you'd have cause to reconsider a few different decisions, and one of them might be the date of the calling of the election. One of them might be the advice to Julia Gillard to challenge Kevin Rudd at all. I'm sure that this will be chewed out at great length in weeks and months to come.
Her better judgment, I think she was talked into going ahead with the challenge.
I'm absolutely convinced of that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Stephen Leslie, isn't that the key structural problem of this whole campaign for Labor, is that they voted against themselves just 8 weeks ago. If this was a good government, then they'd still have the same Prime Minister. And that must be the hesitation in the electorate's mind.
Well, I make a couple of points here. First of all, I think it was essential for the Parliamentary Labor Party to change leaders. And Julia Gillard was far and away the best to lead. I have no doubt that decision was the right one. It was unfortunate but unavoidable. Secondly, given the kind of destabilising leaks that we saw in a week or so of the campaign's opening, I think one can imagine what that kind of destabilisation from some of the dissident elements in the caucus and beyond would have been like if the Parliament had stayed in session and the Prime Minister had endeavoured to establish herself over the ensuing 3 months. I think that would have made life difficult. The final point I'd make is I think Julia has come through very strongly in this campaign. I think she's handled a lot of difficult circumstances with real substance and real style and with amazing good humour. And I don't think she's been given credit for that. I acknowledge Tony Abbott's performance as a campaigner, a blue pencil tick there, but I don't think Julia Gillard's been given the credit to which she's entitled for a really superb effort at campaigning in very difficult circumstances.
Yeah, can I add to that? And not that it means anything to have a journalist add to that, but I think that we vastly underestimate the difficulty of these jobs, and I take my hat off to anybody who can get through 5 weeks of this, because I'd be clouting journalists by the end of it. I've got to say, I'd be taking a swing at a few in particular. Today's polls have brought good news for Tony Abbott. Newspoll has the party's